For far too long, Africa has not been underdeveloped, it has been underrepresented. The greatest weapon used against Africa was not the gun, nor the chains, it was the camera. The lens of Western media became the modern-day colonizer, exporting images that did not reflect truth, but propaganda. CNN, BBC, France 24, these are not merely news agencies. They are architects of perception, and what they built was a global image of Africa drenched in misery, failure, chaos, and helplessness. They did not just report on suffering, they magnified it, recycled it, and weaponized it. And as the world watched, Africa forgot who she was. For decades, Western media platforms painted Africa with one brush: famine, war, disease, corruption, and despair. They zoomed in on broken villages, not booming cities. They reported every conflict, but never our triumphs. They spotlighted poverty but ignored innovation. They never told the world about the African child who builds robots from scrap. They didn't show the villages run on solar grids built by our youth. They didn't air the brilliance of our professors, our tech entrepreneurs, our doctors pioneering new treatments. They weren't simply telling stories, they were programming minds. And tragically, this narrative didn't just reach outsiders. It reached Africans themselves. A generation of African children grew up ashamed of their roots. Teenagers began to hate their skin, their languages, their heritage. Young Africans looked to Europe and America not with inspiration, but with inferiority. They believed the lie that they came from the bottom of the world. Because every time they turned on the television, they were told that they were the problem. This was psychological warfare. A war against identity. A war against confidence. A war against Africa's future. But then came Ibrahim Traoré, not just a soldier or a president, but a revolutionary voice in an age of silence. He refused to sit quietly while the world slandered his people. He refused to bow to narratives designed to keep Africa in chains, not physical chains, but mental ones. He stood before the world and exposed the deliberate distortion. He named the culprits: CNN, BBC, France 24. He confronted their hypocrisy. He challenged their silence on African excellence. He condemned their obsession with African suffering. And above all, he restored a lost truth: Africa is not poor. Africa is plundered. Africa is not broken. Africa is rising. Traoré didn't fight with bullets. He fought with truth. And truth is dangerous to those who live off lies. He told the youth, "You are not what they say you are. You are not cursed. You are the descendants of empires. You are the sons and daughters of warriors, kings, queens, scholars, and inventors. The world fears your awakening, that's why they tried to bury your pride." And something began to shift. Young Africans stopped waiting for validation from the West. They started building, creating, speaking. They started wearing their natural hair with pride. They started dreaming in their own languages again. They began to believe in themselves. Because Traoré didn't ask the West to see Africa differently, he asked Africans to see themselves truthfully. The impact was seismic. He redefined leadership, not as obedience to foreign powers, but as defense of African dignity. He made it clear, Africa does not need pity. Africa needs justice. Africa does not need saviors. Africa needs truth. Africa does not need cameras that exploit pain. Africa needs voices that elevate pride. The age of begging for positive media coverage is over. The age of self-definition has begun. Traoré exposed the West's media agenda for what it is: a system of psychological control. A machine that feeds on Africa's humiliation to justify continued exploitation. But his revolution is not just political. It is spiritual. It is mental. It is generational. He reminded us that the greatest battle is not on the battlefield. It is in the mind. And by liberating the African mind, he lit a fire that no media blackout can extinguish. Africa is not what they showed us. Africa is what we know in our hearts. And thanks to leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, we no longer whisper this truth. We shout it. They showed our scars. Now we show our strength. Africa's story is being reclaimed. Word by word. Mind by mind. Generation by generation. The camera no longer controls us. The truth does. For decades, the narrative was clear. If it bleeds, it leads, especially if it bleeds in Africa. To the Western media, African pain was currency. Our tragedies were televised. Our dignity was blurred. Our victories were omitted. Our brilliance was silenced. But this wasn't just about ratings. It was about reinforcement. It was about global psychological engineering. The hidden agenda. Why were images of starving children in dusty villages repeated thousands of times, while the thriving tech hubs of Nairobi, the innovations in Rwanda, the literacy explosion in Ghana, or the clean energy revolutions in Ethiopia were ignored? Why was the warlord always center stage, but the teacher rebuilding minds in war-torn zones was never interviewed? Why was the microphone passed to foreign experts on Africa, but African intellectuals, professors, and cultural elders were nowhere to be seen? Because the narrative of a hopeless Africa justifies foreign control. It justifies military presence, economic interference, mineral theft, and aid dependency. If Africa is seen as incapable, then intervention looks like charity, not exploitation. And so the story was scripted. Africans are not leaders, they are victims. Africans are not innovators, they are recipients. Africans are not equal, they are beneath. This is not journalism. This is psychological warfare. The wounds within. But the most dangerous impact was not what the world thought of us. It was what we began to think of ourselves. We began to feel ashamed of our villages, of our languages, of our names. Parents pushed English and French over Yoruba, Zulu, Wolof, or Lingala, not out of ignorance, but out of trauma. Skin bleaching became a silent epidemic. Education meant escape, not elevation of the motherland. We began to associate value with distance from ourselves. The more African you were, the more you were seen as backward, even by your own. This was not an accident. This was a system where media was the weapon, and Africa was the target. Then the fire spoke. Ibrahim Traoré rises. Ibrahim Traoré stepped into history not as a politician, but as a mirror. He held that mirror to Africa and said, "Look again. Look past the lies. Look past their headlines. Look into your soul. What do you see?" And for the first time in a long time, Africans saw themselves clearly. Traoré exposed the West's manipulation with fearlessness. He didn't beg for fair reporting. He dismantled the entire structure. He didn't ask for validation. He exposed the lie that we ever needed it. His speeches were not just political, they were medicinal. They healed the wounded pride of millions. They reignited ancestral memory. They reminded us, we were never defeated, we were misrepresented. The revolution of self-worth. Traoré's resistance sparked something far greater than geopolitics. It unleashed a spiritual revolution. Young Africans began to research their true history, not the colonized version, but the unfiltered truth of kingdoms, empires, sciences, and sacred traditions that stretched far before European contact. They discovered the University of Timbuktu, a center of learning long before Oxford. Imhotep, an African who pioneered medical and architectural sciences. The Kushite queens of Nubia, rulers in their own right. The Benin bronzes, masterpieces of metalwork stolen and displayed in European museums as trophies. They saw what was stolen, and more importantly, they saw what still lives in them. Traoré's message was not rise up against the West. His message was rise up within yourselves. Reclaim your voice, your culture, your value, and the world will follow. A movement across the continent. What began in Burkina Faso soon echoed across borders. In Mali, young people formed forums to rewrite school curriculums with African perspectives. In Congo, artists painted murals of African leaders not taught in school. In Nigeria, students demanded that local languages be taught alongside English. In Kenya, tech startups emerged with African names, branding, and mission statements tied to local needs. In Senegal, women's cooperatives revived ancient textile designs banned under colonial regimes. Africa was no longer apologizing. Africa was reclaiming. The battle isn't over, but it has begun. The Western media is afraid. Not of our governments, but of our awakening. Because once a people reclaim their narrative, they reclaim their power. Traoré made it clear. We do not need a camera to tell us who we are. We carry our truth in our blood, our soil, our spirits. The battle for Africa is no longer fought in deserts or on borders. It is fought in the mind. And we are winning. The psychological chains are breaking. The veil is lifting. The lion is no longer asleep. Final word. The Renaissance is irreversible. History will remember this era, not as the era of coups and chaos, but as the era of clarity. An era where Africa finally told her own story. An era where we stopped being seen as developing and started being seen as awakening. An era where one man's voice, sharp, unbending, and fearless, shattered a century of lies. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just expose Western media. He reminded Africa of her voice. And once that voice returned, it roared.